All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for allowing me and being patient with the technical difficulties. I apologize for that. But let's talk a little bit about sports photography. This came out of a request after the last time I judged for you all, and I believe it happened after a comment in one of the pictures that I critiqued. And I thought, you know what, this is a really great idea. I lecture sports photography for Santa Barbara City College, and I was asked to do a lecture on sports photography for a convention coming up later this year. This is just a great opportunity to piece some thoughts together. So I want to start off by saying thanks to the photographers who contributed their work. All of the images are going to be credited if they are not mine. If the images are mine, they're not credited, but I have quite a mix in there. People do such a better job at actually shooting this stuff than I do that I wanted to give them a shout out as well. So Ken Cobre, who is an educator, a photojournalism educator, and the author of a book called Photojournalism, it's a textbook, has this in his book, and I just think that's really appropriate, and that sports photographers are a lot like athletes. They must have the aim of a football quarterback, the reflexes of a basketball guard, and the concentration of a tennis player. And the more I think about this and the more that I present this to my students, the more I completely agree with this concept. And you really have to be on your feet if you want to be there in the moment to capture the moment as it happens. So let's see, talk a little bit about, I'm noticing that part of my, hang on one second, adjust my screen here just a little. Need to be able to see the text. All right. So for photojournalism and any kind of sports photography, we really break it down into two different types. That is sports action. That is a lot of what we see in the newspapers, and people covet those peak action moments. And really the way it happens, the way it's broken down is it's on the field of play, during the play of the players. So a lot of the images you'll see in Sports Illustrated or, like I said, in newspapers or online are going to be sports action, preferably if the moment is the moment of the particular game or the event. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but peak action is really coveted. There's also sports features. Sports features is also sports related, but it's not so much about the action. It could be of the fans, it could be of the coaches, it could be of the refs. But essentially, it's a slice of life that's not about the actual game at the moment that it's actually happening. This is just an incredible image of a bat that flew out of the hands of a swinger, a baseball player. Behind the scenes, or the star quarterback who actually lost the game. And I have to ask myself, and I would encourage you to be asking yourselves as well, why is it you want to photograph sports, or what is it that you intend to do with it? And often it's just for fun, which is totally, it's okay. There's no reason why not to, but I think having a better idea of what your intent is will improve your approach and be able to capture these moments. For game coverage, maybe you're hired, or maybe you are looking to express yourself visually with your camera a little bit more. So game coverage usually includes having images of both sides of the teams, both teams in one image or multiple images to cover that. To feature an athlete, this is something that we ran into quite a bit in newspapers. When they'd say, okay, we're going to do a feature story on a particular player, make sure you go out there and get a good image of them, even if it is a team sport, or it could be an individual sport like skateboarding. Or it could be as simply as practicing your skills. As I mentioned, there's no reason why you shouldn't go photograph sports. Just maybe ask yourself why you're going to do it in the first place. So I'm spending a lot of this PowerPoint to talk about the how in covering sports photography. And some of this will be second nature to you, some of this won't. And I encourage you really there, it doesn't matter how in that if you have the opportunity, go do it if you are so inclined or you want to. But if you are inclined and having difficulties finding sports to photograph, then there are certainly some avenues that I would encourage you to be approaching. And a lot of the local schools, especially the ones you don't have a relationship with, they'll have an athletic director. At the high school level, it's usually one of the coaches or one of the teachers. The athletic director will give you what you need as far as information and or access. Let them know that you are a photographer in your community and you want to go, say, photograph a football game or a soccer match. Usually they're pretty good about allowing people there, but you're definitely going to want to ask for access in advance, and especially if you need access to a field. At the college or university level, this position is the SID office, especially the bigger schools, sports information. Their job is to liaison and to be the PR machine for the school's sports department. But they would be the ones to give you the access and information. Although sports section of local newspapers or online or even local radio can help you preview big games that are happening between the community rivals, or maybe it's a visiting team from out of the area that would be quite excited to go photograph. So keep your eye on the news and what's happening in advance. MaxPrep's website is another wonderful resource for Southern California. I would imagine it's nationwide. I've only paid attention to Ventura, Santa Barbara, and LA counties. The URL will be at the end of this particular presentation as a resource. But MaxPreps is an incredible resource, and it helps you find events, and also it helps you with rosters and IDs and contact information. So more on the how-to. I get this question a lot from students or from anybody who wants to go photograph, a child's soccer match or a baseball game or whatever. The 70-200 f2.8 is going to be the lens that I'm going to recommend the most. And I know that financially that's going to be out of a reach for a lot of you, but this is an incredible utility lens. It's very fast, it's very sharp, and it has a good deal of range in the focal length. 70-200 millimeters is a pretty good range, a medium to a long telephoto. Now, the f2.8 part is probably the most important, and that really goes into any kind of decisions you make about what lens you buy. But almost every sport that I'm going to cover in how-to tonight with this webinar is going to include the suggestion of a 70-200 f2.8 lens. It's just an incredible lens. It doesn't have to be just for sports photography, as a lot of you know. It's also great for outdoor, nature, landscape, certainly portraiture. It's just got an incredible amount of uses. In any sports, you want to scout out the locations of the field, look for clean backgrounds, good light, and this is any sport, indoor or out. I'm always thinking about background and light. Do you have enough light? If so, what's the direction of the light? What is the background light? If I'm going to be shooting with this lens from this direction, what kind of distraction am I going to have back there? Again, this gets to the lensing. So for a lot of sports, and or your limitation in the lensing that you have access to, particularly not having access to super long lenses, then you just need to be patient and wait for the action to come to you. And in most sports, this will eventually happen, including things like surfing or the kinds of sports that occur further out. Just be patient, wait. Don't try to photograph it when it's 200 yards away. It's just not going to make a meaningful picture, even with the good sensor cameras. And shoot lots of pictures. This is something I feel like I had to learn the hard way, and that is working for newspapers back in the day, shooting film. On football games, I gave myself a 10 roll budget. So 36 images per roll, that's 360 pictures. Out of those 360 pictures, shooting at night, usually, in a football match, depending on how much time I had, the whole game or not, Out of those 360, I would be lucky if I had 5 that were technically proficient, that is sharp, well composed, let alone having good moments. And out of those 5, I'd probably have 1 that was certainly worthy of publication, hoping it was of the right play or the right player. So shooting a lot of pictures, particularly with digital, do not be afraid. You're not limited by anything other than the hard drive. And the reason you shoot a lot of pictures is because pictures like this don't come around very often. There's also something that we refer to amongst photojournalism in newspaper particulars called CYA. If you are on the hook for producing a publishable image, you're probably better off making a picture that is something that's repetitive action first. Like in baseball, simple, the pitcher or the hitter. Or in volleyball, the serve, or the tennis, the serve, or in soccer, the header. The kinds of actions that's going to happen quite a bit. Cover yourself, get an image that's worthy, and then you try something different. But the CYA is really a good approach in covering any kind of action sports. So I want to talk just for a few moments about exposure, because this really goes hand in hand when it comes to sports photography or any photography for that matter. In sports photography, it is recommended that you shoot with a 500th of a second or faster. Now, when you're talking about exposure, there are 4 things you need to take into consideration. Some of it is limited by your equipment. Some of it is limited by your location. The illumination, that is, how bright is it? Is it indoors at night or outdoors at night, or is it outdoors in broad daylight? The more light you have, the more flexibility you have with your choices in the rest of the exposure. So shutter speed, the faster, the better, of course, so 500th of a second or stronger. Now, to maintain a proper exposure, though, you can't just jack up the shutter speed to 2500th of a second and not sacrifice somewhere else. So you either need to have a higher ISO, more illumination, or a wider open aperture. So when you purchase lenses, that's why the maximum aperture available to you is so crucial. We call this fast glass. In sports photography, long focal length lenses with a wide aperture is what was known as fast glass. Now, you also pay for it. It's very expensive to purchase that kind of equipment, but you need to keep in mind how the exposure is going to be maintained with what is going to be sacrificed. Modern DSLRs have really strong sensors, so the ISOs aren't that bad at high, like 6400 or 3200. But just keep that in mind as you go out and you make pictures. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the individual sports. I've picked out 5 that are pretty common in Southern California. So for volleyball, one of my favorite places to shoot is actually here, right in front of the pole, right sitting Indian leg style, and you have access to both sides of the courts. And one of the reasons why I like this position is your guaranteed faces. They're facing more towards you. And if the action's on the left side, you can photograph there. The action's on the right side, you can photograph there. The other locations are much more limiting. Your pictures are much more limited. But this is a location that I actually like to photograph in. Get permission, though, before you do this. Long focal length, that is 100 to 300 millimeter range, perpendicular to the net in the back of the court. Way behind where they serve. Usually when I'm in a basketball court that's doubles as a volleyball, I'm sitting with my back against the wall. And the type of picture you're going to get is something like this. And this is good if player number 13 is playing for the team that you're covering, or that's the individual you want to make a picture of. But as you can see, athletes number 8 and number 1, you can't see their faces. And I'm always a proponent for photographing faces. So this vantage point it gets you a good picture, but it's very limiting. Another option for volleyball would be from the stands. One of the reasons why the stands is an option is you're not limited by plexiglass for hockey or a fence or netting for baseball. And you can make some decent pictures from here. As long as you're photographing over people's heads, there are some options. The play doesn't have to be at the net. Sometimes you can get a dig right there on the floor, and it happens. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Natural light, even though this picture was shot with flash, this was one of my students, most refs will not allow you to shoot flash at a volleyball match. If you want to use flash, you should ask first. So natural light, and of course a high shutter speed. And you can see this is an older image. You can tell that the grain is starting to, the noise is starting to break down. It's too high of an ISO for this camera. Serve, bump, spike, or dive are all the other things that occur in volleyball. Serve is actually really great. It's a repetitive action. You're guaranteed this moment, but it's a boring picture. A little bit about soccer. One of the things I do like about soccer is that the vantage point is pretty much anywhere you want to be on the field. Well, that is just off the field. You can roam around 360 degrees and you pretty much have free reign. You can stand, you can kneel. They're usually pretty accommodating about that. And the bad part about soccer, though, is you can't chase the action, not like you can with football. Because they're just moving back and forth too much. You're going to wear yourself out just carrying your equipment. So what I usually do in soccer is I pick a location and I just camp out and I wait. And that location is usually based on the light, the direction of the light, and also the background. But you pretty much have free reign. Soccer, the pitch is much larger than pretty much anything else you're going to photograph, so a longer lens does help. I do like clean backgrounds in soccer. So like I was mentioning, where you position yourself on the field should be determined partially at least by what's in the background. The direction of light. This is a beautiful sunset picture. Sometimes backlight can be very accommodating. It can give you really good separation with the background. But see how well their faces are illuminated? Of course, fast shutter speeds. Soccer moves very fast. I mean, even if you can photograph at a 2,000th or 4,000th of a second, I certainly would if you have the opportunity with enough light and or higher ISOs. Day games, not so much of a consideration. Be patient, wait for the action to come to you. It will. It's Murphy's Law. You know, if you move from one corner to the other because a lot of the actions happen on the other side of the field, what's going to happen is the action's going to be back where you were. So just be patient. Tell this to my students all the time. Then they tell me, well, I've only got 10 minutes to photograph. I'm like, yeah, you should probably wait the entire 90 minutes. So football. If you have access to the field, and again, this is not one of those things that you probably need permission. Even at the high school level, they are limiting access to credentialed photographers or members of the staff and or the student body. But if you do, you're going to need to run around. You will need to follow the action. I do recommend following in front of the line of scrimmage. But you can pretty much photograph from any angle, from any vantage, almost from any angle, from any vantage point. If you have the opportunity to photograph with two cameras, that's fantastic. I would put a short to medium telephoto on your one camera and then a longer telephoto on the other. Because in football, the action will come towards you, and when it does, you want to be ready. This picture cannot be made with a long telephoto just because the focus wouldn't be able to keep up, and at some point they're going to be too close and you're going to get tackled. Long, though. A lot of football fields want you to kneel or stand, and if you are standing, I would use a monopod. Long lenses can be very heavy, so a monopod does help. Avoid crossing in front of the players, coaches, or refs. So you'll notice that on football fields, there is a giant box marked out, usually in white, that's on the field. And it's usually in the location of what I've shown you here on these blue boxes. These are where the coaches and the players will stand. They're kind of held to this box, although they often encroach outside of it. So if you do need to cross over to the other side of the field from, say, the left to the right, you want to go behind them. Never camp in front. The only time I've ever actually been able to stand in this box has been with local teams that I've photographed for years and years and years, where the coaches and the players, they know me, they trust me. But for the most part, I give them wide space and I just go around. But otherwise, you have really good access. Now, the light does fall off when you get into the infields. A popular location to photograph is on the outside of the end zone. I'm not a big fan of that because you're at that point photographing backlight. The lights are typically towards the middle of the field. But otherwise, you can photograph from any direction at any point that you want. In front of the line of scrimmage means that the action will be coming towards you. The exception would be if you want to photograph a good picture of, say, the quarterback as he drops back. You can be just behind the line of scrimmage, and the quarterback will then just step back enough so that you can hopefully get a clean picture of him. Of course, fast shutter speed, and if it's a night game, you need high ISO. This is a picture I pulled out of my film archives from probably 1996. This was shot with T-Max 3200 black and white film, pushed one stop. So this is 6400 ISO. Now, even with film, the grain certainly breaks down. The picture, the quality is not that good. And with a lot of sports, you want to be able to anticipate what's going to happen. If you know that it's a situation that the quarterback is more than likely going to throw the ball, then who is that person going to be that's going to have the ball thrown to? You know, who's the most likely person? Pre-focus and just compose on that individual player and wait for that to happen. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but when it does, it pays off big. A little bit about basketball. Now, I know this is kind of a convoluted diagram, but really when it comes to basketball, you only have two really clean vantage points. And that's on the floor with your back against the wall in the two corners. Now, when you go to a game, you're going to need to see the refs and what kind of patterns they run. They're responsible for certain sides of the court, and they run up and down and back and forth. Now, if you pick the wrong corner, you're going to be photographing their backs most of the time because they're going to be standing in front of you. But there is a little window you can notice that in the red arrows are indicating where the refs would be. So I bring this up because sometimes the pattern's flipped. Sometimes the lower and the up to the right would be the other side of the court. So pay attention to this and then position yourself accordingly. But from this vantage point, you have access to pictures underneath your net and pictures on the opposite side of the court. So in basketball, if you have the opportunity to have two cameras, I would. On one camera, I would like to have a short telephoto that's fast, or even a 50 millimeter that's also fast. That is a wide open aperture. And you can get pictures that are occurring right in front of you, right underneath the net. That's a really good vantage point. Usually get good faces here. Longer focal length on a second body, if you have it, you just switch back and forth as they run up and down the court. You do have time. Longer focal length is good for the opposite end of the court underneath the other net. It's good for defense or sometimes, turnovers. Natural light, high ISO, fast shutter speed, 500th of a second or better. You do not want to use a flash without permission. So you just have to go with the natural light. A lot of the gymnasiums now, they're getting better and better. For years, it was terrible. You had to shoot at least 6400, and you were lucky if you got a 1/125th of a second. Now, especially with the LED lights, they're pretty bright, so it's really nice. As I mentioned, I usually sit on the floor with my back against the wall. You're out of the way. Nobody's going to trip on you. And you're not really mobile, but at that point, with this particular game, the action's not to the point where you really need to worry about it. A few how-tos in baseball with a convoluted diagram. If you have access to the field, this is a big if you have access to the field, there's a couple of locations that I particularly liked. And that is, one is kind of above, behind first base, and then also the same location for third base. And this gives you vantage points to several areas. You want to have access to the plates and you also want to have access to the pitcher. So from the third base position, you have access to the pitcher, but not really anything else. Maybe first base if you photograph across. My favorite vantage point would be where the X is over by first base. And the reason is there's a lot of activity at second base, a lot. There's also a lot of activity at home plate. So it really gives you a kind of vantage point. Now you can photograph the outfield. It's a little bit more challenging. You need a longer lens, and that way the vantage point doesn't really matter. But that's if you have access to the field. If you don't have access to the field, you have to photograph through the fence, and it can be kind of challenging. But my favorite vantage point would be right behind behind and to the right of the ump and the catcher. But my favorite lens would be, without a doubt, would be the 70-200. But if you have 300 millimeter available to you, certainly do it. Here is a good pickle image made between first and second base. Fast shutter speed, of course. Baseball, when it does happen, it's such a slow sport. It's so unusual. You got 9 innings or maybe 8 1/3 innings of nothing, and then all of a sudden something explodes. A lot of pitching, a lot of swinging, but not a lot of this. But when it does happen, you want to be ready. I mentioned CYA. Baseball is a really good one for CYA. You got the pitcher, you've got the swinging. You know, every motion, it's going to happen a lot, at least 9 times every inning, or every half an inning, I guess. Anticipate the action. Anticipating action is going to be really crucial in all sports photography. So if you've got runners on base, you know, then there's a good chance that the action is going to be at the next base down. Or if they try to steal, the action is going to be at the base they were at. So you really need to be thinking about where to pre-position your camera so that when the action does occur. These kinds of sports happen so fast, you're not going to be able to follow the action with a pan. It's just not going to happen. So you pre-position your composition. So if you have access to a 70-200 and you're getting really used to it and you enjoy it, then see about getting a longer, faster lens. Even if you really, really, really enjoy this, then I would encourage you to try something like a 300 millimeter 2.8, which you can rent. They're very expensive. Or even longer. The 500 f4 or the 400 f4, 600 f4 are really great lenses. Now they're huge. You need a tripod or a monopod. They're very heavy, but they make you really incredible pictures. So photographers who shoot sports a lot, in this case in Columbus, Ohio, with the Ohio State University football team, they're much more comfortable with this type of lens. But if you're not practiced in sports photography or big equipment like this, it's not a good idea to go and rent something like this. I would definitely start with the 70-200. That's a much smarter choice. Already mentioned, be patient, wait for the action to come to you. This is particularly for those of you who can't afford longer telephoto lenses. Be patient. At some point, the action will come to you, I promise. Shoot lots of pictures. Lots of pictures. I mentioned earlier about the 360 frame counts I gave myself to, photographing football with film. With digital, it's not uncommon for me to shoot 1,000 images in one particular game. Just do it. Put it on continuous high and let her rip. There's no reason why you shouldn't. Good pictures are very hard. Sports is a low percentage activity when it comes to making meaningful images. You can pre-plan all you want, but if the moment doesn't occur when you're ready in your field of view, then it doesn't really make a difference. And the focus can really be off within a couple of inches in your subject matter. So photograph a lot. 1% of your pictures, you're doing really well. And anticipation is really the secret. If I were to boil down this entire lecture into one word, I would say the anticipation of it all is what it's all about. Being able to anticipate what's going to happen before it happens, you can pre-position so that you do make meaningful images. Now, luck definitely comes into play. I like sharing this image from Nordhoff in 1990, I guess, about. I think I shot maybe 3 or 4 rolls of film at this particular water polo match, and this turned out to be a really graphic image. The goalie jumping up to block the ball with his face, but it's only looks that way. Because of the compression of the 300 millimeter lens I was using, it looks like the ball is bouncing off his nose. In reality, the ball is still a few feet away, and he was able to manage to block it off. But this is a lucky shot, and was only lucky because, I mean, I shot a lot of frames, and I kind of knew what I was doing. So knowing the sport is going to help you. So if you're going to go photograph a sport, especially a sport that you never played or never watched or not a fan of, you should probably do some research first. What are the rules? Who are the players? Who are the teams? You know, who are the A players on that particular team you're going to go photograph? What are the rules? And if you don't know the rules, look them up, or look at examples of that photography for that particular sport. There are a lot of access to examples. Just type in sports photography. You're going to see a bunch of examples. I'm including a couple of links at the back of this presentation so that if you want to go to, like, say, Sports Illustrated or ESPN, I mean, there's just a tremendous a lot. There's no reason why you shouldn't know a little bit more about what you're getting into before you get into. Another thing that I encourage my students is to attend a sporting event without their camera. Just soak it in, get to know it. I guess if you're a wrestler, you kind of know how this works, but if you're not, it's kind of a hard picture to make.
Beautiful.
If you are really interested in moment photography, like I am myself, I'm a big fan of team-related sports, basketball, baseball, soccer, football, where there's interaction. Individual sports are okay, but they lack that interaction. And usually the lack of interaction is challenging to find better moments. Research the sport, anticipate the action. So individual sports are fine. There's certainly no reason why you can't or shouldn't. But if you are, look for good action, good vantage point, anticipate, know the rules, know the players.
Ooh.
Yeah, I tend to agree, especially with the blood coming out of the bull's mouth. Golf is much more challenging to photograph than you would possibly imagine. A lot of rules involved in golf too, like not being in front of the player when they're about to swing, not actually making pictures until the ball has made contact with the club. There's a lot of rules you should be in consideration of the athletes as well. We have a lot of access to surfing in Southern California, so my students tend to gravitate towards that. Off-roading is a viable sport. Be careful where you stand. Skateboarding too. Look for if you go to a skate park and you want to practice your skills, watch the skaters for a few minutes and find out who the good ones are, and then photograph them. So all these pictures so far have been action. I'm also a big fan of features. Features is actually probably a little bit more near and dear to my heart. I'm more interested in the slices of life. You know, what makes people tick? What's exciting about it? It's not just the action that really draws me in. It's everything else. Also behind the scenes, sports feature. I lived in Columbus, Ohio for 3 years, working for the Columbus Dispatch, and I was there the year that they got their expansion team, the Columbus Blue Jackets, and I had never photographed hockey. I grew up in Southern California, so I was really anxious to go and photograph as a second shooter. And I got bored with the action, so I started photographing features, including this fight that broke out, and I love the family right behind the glass at a hockey match, protecting their kids from the fight. I thought that was kind of amusing. A lot of us are parents. We often know what it's like to give encouragement to our children when it comes to sports. or just a reaction? This was a state high school softball championship. Team in the white was favored to win, and they lost at the last minute. I was ready. Sports features. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily harder to photograph. They're just not as well known. You don't see them as often. This is Ohio State University football, closed to the public, so the kids still found a way to watch. So I have just a couple more slides left, and I want to leave it with this quote: sports does not build character, they revealed it. And I tend to agree that. I think sports photography is an incredible opportunity. One of the advantages to photographing sports, especially for my students, is the game is scheduled. You have access to moments, because moments occur. Often getting names, which is really important for newspaper photojournalism, is viable. It's easy, and it's in a confined location. You can't really say that if you want to go, say, photograph an elk. You know, it might take you a little bit longer. Tracking them down is not like you can just go to a zoo. So photographing sports is really exciting. Here's some of the websites that I mentioned: Max Preps for accessing schedules and rosters, contact information. For those of you who are really interested in sports photography, sportsshooter.com is an organization of like-minded professional sports photographer. SISLP is another website that would be a resource. Rules of Sports is what it is. ESPN, Sports Illustrated, USA Today, and Sporting News are a couple of other websites that are really encouraging when it comes to giving you access to examples. So that's kind of it for my PowerPoint.